Silas Ward looked no different from many other cowboys on the frontier, hands hardened by labor, old boots covered in dust, and a man who spoke only when it was truly necessary. He had built his ranch himself 15 years earlier. Every beam and every plank carried the mark of sweat and patience. To Silas, life was very simple: work hard, pay fairly, and keep your word. He was not curious about the past of the people he hired. Anyone who needed work was willing to work hard, and was honest, was welcome. That was how Mercy Whitmore entered his life 3 months earlier, a young woman with tired eyes, as if she had been through far more than someone in her early 20s should. She needed a job, and Silas needed someone to help in the house. That was the entire arrangement. No questions, no investigation. Mercy worked quietly, spoke little, and always kept her distance. Silas respected that. From a lifetime of dealing with land and people, he believed that those who spoke less often carried much worth listening to. The ranch ran smoothly. Day after day passed in a familiar rhythm, and Silas believed that everything was exactly where it should be. He had no idea that this calm was only a fragile shell, hiding a storm that was about to break. That morning, as Silas Ward returned from the grazing fields, a brief image through the window made him stop short. Mercy was moving around the kitchen, but she was no longer as quick as usual. Every step was heavy and cautious, as if one small mistake would make the pain flare up. Her right leg dragged slightly across the floor, and her hand kept reaching for the edge of the table or the back of a chair to keep her balance. Silas stood still and watched. He had seen this kind of walk before, not in people, but in injured animals trying to hide their pain so they would not appear weak. The way Mercy bent down to pick up a spoon she had dropped, the excessive care in every movement, all pointed to one thing: this was not a new injury, and it was not the first time. When Silas stepped into the house, Mercy immediately straightened up, trying to appear normal. She greeted him softly, but the tremor in her breathing betrayed the effort. Silas saw fear in her eyes, not fear of him, but the fear of someone who was always bracing for sudden pain. With a lifetime of experience reading the signs of land and living creatures, Silas understood that something very serious was happening to Mercy. And the most troubling part was this: her condition was getting worse. When Silas spoke up to ask, the small kitchen seemed to hold its breath. Mercy turned to face him, her hands still gripping the edge of the table, as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. On her face, Silas saw marks that the morning light could not hide: a small cut at the corner of her mouth, a pale yellow bruise on her cheekbone, and tired eyes carrying the familiar resignation of someone far too used to pain. Mercy quickly said that she had fallen down the stairs the night before. The answer came out too fast, as if it had been practiced many times, but Silas knew every patch of ground on his ranch. Mercy's cabin stood on flat land, with only a single low step at the doorway. There were no stairs at all. He did not expose the lie right away. Silas quietly set his coffee cup down and asked to see those stairs. The request was gentle, but it was enough to drain the color from Mercy's face. In that brief moment, the truth was clearer than any confession could have been. The silence between them grew heavy and suffocating, like smoke lingering after a fire had burned out. At last, Mercy turned away and said she needed to get back to her work. Her limping walk told Silas that this was not the first time she had endured pain in silence, and he understood that the lie was not meant to deceive him but to protect herself from something far more frightening. Silas stood still, watching Mercy as she disappeared behind the door of the storage room. Each careful step she took carved another question into his mind. These injuries were not from an accident. They were signs of repetition, of pain that had become routine. Silas understood this better than anyone. He had seen beaten animals learn how to endure in silence, and Mercy was living the same way. All his life, Silas had avoided trouble. He believed everyone had their own battles, and his role was not to interfere. But this time was different. This was no longer about curiosity or pity. It was about right and wrong. And if he continued to look away, he would become part of the silence that allowed evil to survive. That afternoon, Silas began to watch. Quietly, without drawing attention, without haste. He worked around the horse barn, but his eyes never left the road leading from town to the small cabin behind the ranch. He did not know what he would see. He only knew that the truth, no matter how ugly, had to be faced. In that moment, Silas Ward made a decision that would change both his life and Mercy's. He would find the person responsible, and he would not allow it to continue for even one more day. If you were in Silas's position, what would you do? Stay silent to avoid trouble, or stand up even if it meant facing danger? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. The sun was beginning to sink toward the mountains when Silas pretended to fix an old bridle near the horse barn. The task was only an excuse. What truly held his attention was the dirt road leading from town to the ranch, the road Mercy never used, yet always made her uneasy whenever she heard hoofbeats in the distance. Then the man appeared. From far away, Silas recognized the lazy way of riding and the familiar, arrogant attitude of Deputy Vernon Briggs. The badge on his chest glinted in the afternoon sun, but that shine brought no sense of safety. It felt cold, like a knife blade. Briggs dismounted in front of Mercy's cabin, cast a quick glance around the ranch like someone afraid of being seen, then knocked hard on the door with the back of his hand. The door opened almost immediately. Mercy stepped back as Briggs entered, her body shrinking, painfully submissive. From a distance, Silas could not hear the words exchanged, but he understood the language of fear all too well. The door closed, leaving the yard oppressively quiet. 20 minutes passed like 20 hours. When Briggs came out, he adjusted his gun belt with a satisfied air, whistling a carefree tune. Mercy appeared afterward, gripping the doorframe to keep from collapsing, her body stiff with pain. In that moment, all the pieces fell into place. Silas had no doubts left. What caused all of this was not an accident, but a man wearing a badge, a man who had turned power into a tool of abuse. The next morning, the sky was covered in a heavy gray, matching the mood inside the small kitchen. Mercy appeared, moving even more slowly than the day before, her hair pulled low to hide fresh bruises on her neck. She avoided Silas's eyes as she set breakfast on the table, as if a single glance would cause everything she was trying to hide to fall apart. Silas did not go around the issue. He asked directly about Deputy Briggs and the times he had come to her cabin. Just hearing the name made Mercy's hands shake, and the coffee pot nearly slipped from her grip. Silence stretched for a few breaths, then the wall of endurance she had built finally collapsed. She broke down in tears and told him about 3 months of living in fear since the day she arrived in town. Briggs had noticed her from the beginning, using promises and threats to control her. He abused his badge to make her believe no one would ever trust her words. If she dared to speak out, she would disappear, just like others before her. Mercy had not stayed because she wanted to, but because she had no way out, no money, no family, and no place willing to take her in because of the false protection label Briggs had deliberately spread. Silas was the only one who gave her work without asking questions. When her story ended, the kitchen fell into silence. Silas felt a cold anger rise in his chest. This was no longer ordinary abuse of power. This was deliberate evil, and it had been allowed to exist in silence for far too long. When Mercy finished speaking, Silas slowly stood up, placing both hands flat on the wooden table as if to keep the anger inside him from exploding. He understood exactly what he was facing. The person who had harmed Mercy was not some unknown man, but someone wearing a lawman's badge, someone the entire town feared and respected. Going against him meant putting himself in danger. Mercy begged Silas not to do anything. She was afraid that if he stepped in, Briggs would take revenge, or worse, use his authority to frame Silas for crimes he had never committed. But Silas had already made his decision. He did not make grand promises or offer long comfort. He simply said that this would end, no matter the cost. Silas left the kitchen in the dull light of early morning. The road leading into town stretched out before him, dusty and silent. Each step was a way of preparing himself for an unavoidable confrontation. He was not going to start a fight. He was going to seek the truth and justice. For the first time in many years of living withdrawn from the world, Silas Ward chose to step beyond the safety of his boundaries. He understood that if he remained silent, he would be no different from those who had turned away from Mercy's suffering. And there are moments in life when standing still is the most dangerous choice of all. The main street of Cedar Falls was usually full of noise, but that morning the atmosphere felt strangely tense. Silas Ward walked down the street with a calm manner, even as every eye turned toward him. Everyone knew, When Silas left his ranch and came into town, something serious was about to happen. Deputy Vernon Briggs was standing in front of the saloon, laughing loudly, his badge shining on his chest like an unspoken warning. Silas stopped a few steps away and spoke Mercy Whitmore's name out loud. Just one short sentence, but it was enough to wipe the smile from Briggs's face. Silas's accusation rang out in the middle of the street. Briggs had abused his power to harm a vulnerable woman. The crowd fell completely silent. Briggs exploded in anger, denied everything, and drew his gun, pushing the situation to the edge of bloodshed. A shot rang out, followed by a violent struggle amid the panic of the townspeople. But in that moment of chaos, everything changed. Marshal Kane appeared and forced both men to stop. Under the eyes of the townsfolk, Briggs's aggression was no longer a show of strength. It became the clearest proof of his guilt. The truth, once exposed in the open and before witnesses, was no longer something that could be buried as easily as before. The silence after the gunshot stretched until it became suffocating. Marshal Kane stood in the middle of the street, his stern gaze moving over the pale face of Vernon Briggs and the townspeople who were slowly regaining their composure. For the first time in many years, Briggs was no longer in control. He stepped back, his voice unsteady as he clung to the badge on his chest like a final lifeline. But what Briggs did not expect was this. Silas was not standing alone. From within the crowd, hesitant voices at first began to grow clearer. An elderly woman stepped forward, then the blacksmith, then the general store owner. One story followed another: threats, money that had gone missing, young women who had been forced to leave town in fear. Each testimony was like a hammer blow, shattering the shell of Briggs's authority. Silas produced a torn piece of cloth found near Mercy's cabin, matching the shirt Briggs was wearing. The evidence was small, but it was enough to tie all the accusations into a truth that could not be denied. Marshal Kane stared at Briggs for a long moment, then slowly announced the arrest. When the jail cell door slammed shut, the sound of metal rang out like a final judgment. The man who had once spread fear throughout the town now faced the very justice he had betrayed. Power could no longer shield evil, and Briggs began to pay for everything he had done. Sunset settled over the ranch in a soft, golden light, so different from the heavy days before. When Silas returned, he saw Mercy sitting on the cabin steps, quietly gazing toward the distant mountains as if she were learning how to breathe freely again. Hearing the sound of hooves, she stood up, her eyes filled with worry mixed with fragile hope. Silas said only one short sentence. It was over. Vernon Briggs had been jailed, and he would no longer have any chance to harm her or anyone else. At those words, Mercy collapsed onto the step, tears spilling out not from fear, but from relief. They were the tears of someone who had just escaped a nightmare that had lasted far too long. In the quiet of the evening, Silas did not make grand promises. He simply said that Mercy could stay, work, and heal at her own pace. No one would force her, no one would control her. For the first time in many months, Mercy smiled a cautious smile, but a genuine one. Darkness slowly spread across the valley, and stars began to appear. Silas understood that sometimes justice does not come from the loudest or most powerful people, but from an ordinary person who dares to stand up at the right moment. The truth had set Mercy free, and it had also freed him from the long silence he had lived with for many years.